When we think of ancient Rome, our minds fill with images of marble temples gleaming in the sun, triumphant armies marching through victory arches, and emperors commanding the known world from their golden palaces. We picture gladiators fighting for glory, philosophers debating in grand forums, and an empire that brought civilization to millions. But here's what they don't show you in the movies. Behind all that magnificent architecture and military might was a society built on human suffering so profound, so widespread, that it's almost impossible to comprehend from our modern perspective. Let me take you back 2,000 years and show you what life was really like for the average person in Rome. Forget the togas and the laurel wreaths for a moment. Forget the Hollywood version, because the truth is far more disturbing than you might imagine. Picture yourself waking up in Rome as an ordinary citizen. Not a senator, not a wealthy merchant, just a regular person trying to survive. You're living in an insula, one of those massive apartment buildings that tower 5, 6, sometimes 7 stories high. These weren't luxury condos. These were death traps. Built cheaply and quickly by landlords who cared only about profit, they were constructed mostly from wood and mud brick. Fire was an absolutely constant terror. There was no running water above the first floor, no sanitation, no fire escapes. The smell alone would knock you backwards if you could time travel there. Human waste was regularly thrown out of windows into the streets below. There was a saying in Rome, "Watch out for the chamber pots." Because that wasn't a joke. People literally dumped their excrement out their windows, and if you were walking below at the wrong time, well, that was your problem. The streets ran with sewage, rotting food, and animal carcasses. But the housing situation gets even worse. These insulae collapsed regularly. We're not talking about once in a generation. We're talking about apartment buildings pancaking and crushing everyone inside with alarming frequency. The Emperor Augustus had to pass laws limiting building height because landlords kept stacking floors higher and higher until the structures simply gave way. You could go to sleep at night never knowing if you'd wake up buried under rubble. And if the building didn't collapse, it might burn down instead. The Great Fire of 64 AD under Nero is famous, but fires ravaged Rome constantly. Imagine living every single day knowing your home could collapse or burn down at any moment. That was normal life for hundreds of thousands of Romans. Now let's talk about something even more fundamental to Roman society. Slavery. We throw that word around, but we don't really grasp the scale of it in ancient Rome. At the height of the empire, somewhere between 20 and 30% of the population of Italy were enslaved people. In the city of Rome itself, that percentage was even higher. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of human beings who were property, who could be bought, sold, beaten, raped, or killed with virtually no legal consequences for their owners. Here's what makes Roman slavery particularly nightmarish. It wasn't based on race like the later Atlantic slave trade. Anyone could become a slave. You could be born free, living your life as a farmer or a craftsman, and then your city gets conquered by a Roman army. Congratulations, you're now merchandise. Your wife, your children, everyone you know, all sold off to different owners, never to see each other again. Rome's military conquests flooded the slave markets with human beings. After Julius Caesar's conquest of Gaul, hundreds of thousands of people were enslaved. The work these enslaved people did was backbreaking and deadly. Sure, some became household servants or tutors, and their lives might have been marginally better. But the vast majority worked in agriculture, in mines, or in workshops under conditions that were simply hellish. In the silver mines of Spain or the marble quarries of Italy, enslaved people were worked to death, literally. Their life expectancy once they entered the mines was measured in months, not years. They worked in darkness, breathing toxic dust, beaten by overseers, given barely enough food to keep them alive. Agricultural slavery was its own special horror. Large estates called latifundia used gangs of enslaved workers who lived in barracks, chained at night to prevent escape. They worked from sunrise to sunset in all weather, and if they didn't work hard enough or fast enough, they were whipped or worse. Some estate owners branded their slaves' faces. Others put them in iron collars that couldn't be removed, with tags that read, "I am a runaway, return me to my master." And let's be absolutely clear about something. Enslaved women and children faced additional horrors. Sexual abuse was rampant and completely legal. An enslaved woman had no rights over her own body. Her owner could rape her whenever he wanted, or lend her to his friends, or force her into prostitution. Enslaved children born in these circumstances were themselves enslaved from birth, their lives predetermined as property. The cruelty wasn't hidden or shameful. It was normal. Cato the Elder, held up as a model of Roman virtue, wrote in his farming manual that you should work your slaves hard while they're young and healthy, then sell them when they get old or sick because they're no longer useful. That was considered sound economic advice. Now imagine you're not a slave but a free Roman citizen living in the city. You've avoided enslavement. You've got your little apartment in that rickety insula we talked about. What's your life like? Well, if you're employed at all, you're probably working for subsistence wages in brutal conditions. Maybe you're a construction worker hauling stone in the blazing sun for 12 hours a day. Or maybe you can't find work at all because you're competing with slave labor. Why would a business owner pay you a wage when he can buy a slave who costs nothing to maintain beyond basic food and shelter? Unemployment in Rome was chronic. Tens of thousands of citizens had no real employment and survived on the grain dole, the free wheat the government distributed to prevent riots. Speaking of food, let's talk about what people actually ate. If you were poor in Rome, your diet was mind-numbingly monotonous and nutritionally inadequate. Wheat porridge. That's basically it. Day after day, meal after meal, wheat porridge. Maybe you could add some cheap vegetables if you were lucky, or a bit of olive oil. Meat was a luxury most people tasted only at festivals. Then there's disease. Rome was a pestilential nightmare. Pack hundreds of thousands of people into a relatively small area with inadequate sanitation, contaminated water, and no understanding of germ theory, and you get a perfect breeding ground for every pathogen imaginable. Malaria was endemic in Rome, carried by mosquitoes breeding in the marshes and stagnant water throughout the city. Recurring fevers, chills, and anemia weakened the population constantly. Many historians believe malaria killed more Romans than all the wars combined. Typhoid and dysentery swept through regularly, spread by contaminated water and food. These diseases caused horrible deaths, with victims suffering through days or weeks of fever, delirium, and uncontrollable diarrhea. Tuberculosis was everywhere, spreading easily in the crowded, poorly ventilated insulae. Once you contracted it, you basically had a death sentence. And then there were the plagues. The Antonine Plague, probably smallpox, hit Rome in 165 AD and killed millions across the empire over the next 15 years. The plague of Cyprian in the 250s AD killed thousands per day in Rome at its peak. These weren't just numbers. These were real people watching their families die. Bodies piling up faster than they could be buried. Medical care, if you could call it that, was primitive and often more dangerous than the diseases themselves. Roman doctors had no concept of sterilization. Surgery was performed with instruments that were used on patient after patient without cleaning. Their treatments were based on completely wrong theories about how the body worked. They believed in the four humors, that disease was caused by imbalances of blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. If you were a woman in Rome, your situation was even more precarious. Childbirth was one of the leading causes of death for women. With no understanding of hygiene, No antibiotics. No proper obstetric care. Complications during pregnancy and delivery killed both mothers and babies at horrifying rates. A woman might expect to be pregnant 10 or more times in her life, and losing multiple children to stillbirth, birth complications, or infant disease was completely normal. And Roman society was deeply patriarchal. Women were legal property, first of their fathers, then of their husbands. They couldn't vote, couldn't hold public office, couldn't control property in most circumstances. Domestic violence was not just legal but expected. A husband had the right to beat his wife to discipline her. Let's turn to entertainment, because this is where Roman society reveals its true brutality in ways that are almost incomprehensible. The gladiatorial games weren't some honorable combat between willing warriors. They were mass slaughter for public amusement. Most gladiators were slaves, prisoners of war, or condemned criminals who had no choice in the matter. They were trained to kill each other while crowds of thousands cheered and placed bets. The mortality rate among gladiators was staggering. Recent research suggests that 1 in 5 gladiators died in the arena. These weren't quick, clean deaths. They were prolonged, agonizing spectacles designed to entertain. A wounded gladiator might beg for mercy, and the crowd would vote with thumbs up or down, deciding whether he lived or died. But the gladiator fights were just the beginning. The Romans loved their beast hunts, where exotic animals were brought from across the empire to be slaughtered in the arena. Thousands of lions, bears, elephants, leopards, and other animals were killed in single events. At the inauguration of the Colosseum, they killed 9,000 animals over 100 days. And then there were the executions. Public executions were entertainment. Condemned criminals were killed in elaborately cruel ways designed to maximize suffering and spectacle. They were crucified, burned alive, thrown to wild animals, or forced to fight each other to the death. The damnatio ad bestias, condemnation to the beasts, was particularly popular. Naked, unarmed prisoners would be released into the arena with starved lions or bears. The animals would tear them apart while the crowd cheered. Children attended these events. It was considered normal family entertainment. What does it say about a society that this was how they spent their leisure time? That watching human beings and animals suffer and die was considered fun? Now let's talk about war, because Rome's glory was built on near constant warfare. The expansion of the empire wasn't some noble civilizing mission. It was aggressive conquest driven by greed for land, slaves, and plunder. Roman armies swept across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East, leaving devastation in their wake. When Rome conquered a city, especially one that had resisted, the consequences were apocalyptic. The men would be killed or enslaved. The women would be raped and enslaved. Children would be enslaved. The city might be burned to the ground. Carthage, after the Third Punic War, was completely destroyed. The Romans killed or enslaved every single person, tore down every building, and supposedly salted the earth so nothing would grow there again. But let's not focus only on Rome's enemies. Let's talk about what happened to Roman soldiers themselves. Military service was mandatory for citizens during much of Roman history. You could be conscripted and sent away from your family for years, even decades. Battle in the ancient world was absolutely horrific. Imagine standing in formation, shield to shield with your fellow soldiers, while thousands of enemies charge at you. You're stabbing with your short sword while blood and screams surround you. Men are dying inches from you. Wounds that would be survivable today were death sentences then. The Romans also loved to talk about their Pax Romana, the Roman peace. But this peace was enforced through overwhelming violence. Any province that rebelled was crushed with extreme brutality. When Judea revolted in 70 AD, the Romans besieged Jerusalem, starved the population, then sacked the city. They killed over 1 million people and enslaved many more. So when you think of ancient Rome, yes, remember the aqueducts and the roads and the legal systems that influenced Western civilization. But also remember the millions who suffered to build that civilization. Remember the slaves who died in the mines, the families torn apart by conquest, the people who lived in constant fear of fire and disease and collapse. Remember that Roman glory had a price, and it was paid in human misery on a scale that's hard to fathom. That's the Rome they don't show you in the movies.